I'd like to show you the most amazing game between two of the most creative players ever, Vasily Ivanchuk and Bodar JOBAVA. Ivanchuk starts the game with the move e4, and JOBAVA answers with c6, and we have Caracan defense. Standard move d4 is met with the standard move d5. In this position, white normally plays either e5, or they exchange the pawns, or they play with the knight on c3 or d2, defending the pawn on e4, but in this particular game, Ivanchuk plays a rare variation f3, supporting the pawn on e4. And JOBAVA answers with the move queen b6, also an original move, not allowing the black square bishop to develop because the pawn on b2 would be under attack. Ivanchuk plays a3 to protect the square b4 in the future, and JOBAVA immediately breaks in the center with the move e5. Ivanchuk takes the pawn on d5. JOBAVA doesn't take back and develops the knight on f6. He sacrifices the pawn, and Ivanchuk takes another pawn on the square e5 and attacks JOBAVA knight on f6. JOBAVA ignores the threat completely and develops the bishop on the square c5, sacrificing the knight of f5. Ivanchuk takes the knight on f5. JOBAVA checks the king with the move bishop f2 check, and after king e2, we have a position where white is a piece up, but their king is very unsafe in the middle of the board. In this position, I have to say that JOBAVA could just take the knight on g1 to get the piece back. But his plan is different. He castles and wants to play a rook e8 check. And it's going to be close to a checkmate. And therefore, the only correct move for white in this position is kind of strange looking move, queen d2. And the reason this move is made, because after rook e8 check that JOBAVA played, the king has an escape square on d1 where Ivanchuk put his king. Again, JOBAVA is playing without a knight, but white's king is not safe at all. And JOBAVA plays a rook e1 check. The only move for white is to take the rook, bishop takes the rook, and king takes the bishop. And what do we have in this position? An absolutely amazing position where the only piece developed from both sides is the queen on b6. Every other piece for white and for black is on the squares where they start the game. As to material, white is better because they have a rook, a knight, and a bishop for a queen. And that's better. But again, this particular game is not about material, this is about initiative. And JOBAVA develops the bishop on a square f5. Ivanchuk develops the bishop on e2, knight goes to d7, Ivanchuk takes the pawn on c6, exchange of the pawns on c6, and a bishop goes to d1, protecting the pawn on c2. And now when rook goes to e8 with a check, Ivanchuk can protect his queen with the knight, developing the knight on a square e2. Again, all his pieces are still on the first rank. JOBAVA takes the pawn on f6, moving his knight on a better square, and the developing move knight c3 for white, and bishop goes to c8. The reason for this move is the bishop on f5 has nothing to do anymore, and JOBAVA transfers the bishop to a square a6, from where it can attack the knight on e2, which is pinned. Important notice. a4, a5, not to allow a5 for white. Rook goes to f1, in some variations to protect the square f2. Bishop goes to a6, and now it's on a great diagonal, attacking white pieces. And rook goes to f2 to support the knight on e2. Black has to move quickly here. Otherwise, they're without much of materials. They need to do something very active. And JOBAVA plays h5. He wants to create some play on an h file with the pawn. Rook goes to a3 because you have to develop the pieces somehow. And there is no way to develop the rook the normal way. It has to go through a square a3. h4. Ivanchuk goes g3. Here exchange of the pawns does not happen. And JOBAVA plays h3 to take possession of the square g2. g4. Rook goes on another file on the square d8 because on this file apparently nothing more to catch. So JOBAVA tries to create some game, some play on a d file. Ivanchuk develops his knight to a square f4. It now got unpinned, so he finally can move that knight. Knight goes to d7, transferring the knight to a more active square on e5. White goes to b3, attacking with the rook b3, attacking the queen on b6, and queen goes to the middle of the board. Queen d4. Ivanchuk plays back, attacking the queen, and JOBAVA pins the knight again, so the knight cannot take the queen on d4. White plays knight e4. Now the queen is already under attack, and the queen takes the pawn on a4. Ivanchuk develops the bishop, so slowly, but gradually, slowly, he developed most of his pieces, at least. And JOBAVA tries to attack from a different angle. He goes queen a1 and pins the bishop on the first rank. And now interesting things start happening, because the queen apparently doesn't have many moves, and after bishop c3, the threat is to play rook a3. Ivanchuk couldn't play rook a3 immediately because the pawn on b2 had to be protected, and bishop to c3 accomplishes exactly that, protects the pawn on b2. JOBAVA plays knight e5, and after rook a3, it turns out that the queen is almost trapped. But here it goes to b1, the only square remaining. Ivanchuk moves another knight back, and it seems like the queen has no moves. But JOBAVA finds a great resource, queen c1. Queen c1, and now that's a really nice trap, because if you take the queen with the knight, then knight goes to f3, takes the pawn, and believe it or not, that's a checkmate, because that's a double check, and the square f1 is protected by the bishop. So that's a checkmate. Ivanchuk had to be careful. He obviously didn't take the queen and played a rook takes a5. And that's a double attack on the bishop and on the knight. JOBAVA plays back knight g6, planning to go to f4, because again the knight on e2 is pinned. Rook takes a6. Now white has plenty of extra material, but still have to be very, very careful, because after knight f4, not the only, but the best move in this position is a brilliant move, rook a8. And in this position, JOBAVA playing black resigned. The reason he resigned is because his rook is under attack and it's pinned to the king. And if he takes the rook, then white would simply take the queen, and with extra 2 bishops and a knight, and an extra pawn as well, will easily win this game. So he resigned. But again, in this position, Ivanchuk had to be really careful, because if he, let's say, he played a move like rook a7, after knight g2, it's not so easy, because rook has to take, now, if king goes to f1, That's a checkmate in one move. So again, you have to be careful. Rook takes g2, pawn takes g2, and now the only move in this position to prevent promotion of this pawn is bishop d4. So that's another move he had to see ahead of time in this variation. So he had to be very careful, but the move he made in the game, rook a8, is absolutely brilliant, and that ended this absolutely amazing game that was played really how the game was played maybe in the 19th century, because before computers, before engines were even invented. This is really poetry on the chessboard. Thank you for watching.